This week on From Embers, we feature an interview with Ron Sakolsky, anarchist and surrealist writer based in Denman Island, British Columbia. According to one bio, Ron Sakolsky is a rainforest renegade whose recent books include Creating Anarchy, Swift Winds, and Scratching the Tiger's Belly, all meant as fleeting signposts, illuminating a myriad array of marvelous adventures, disconcerting pitfalls, and dead ends on the constantly unfolding road from mutual acquiescence to mutual aid. His latest book is called In Search of the Masterless Men of Newfoundland and is available through Little Black Cart. I got a chance to sit down with Ron at the 2018 Montreal Anarchist Bookfair. In the first half of this interview, we discuss his life, free jazz music, academia, and the intersections of surrealism and anarchy. In the second half of the interview, we discuss his concept of mutual acquiescence, maroon communities, and his day-to-day life on Denman Island, British Columbia.
My name is Ron Sakolsky, and I'm here in Montreal, visiting from a place called Denman Island in British Columbia. And what attracts me to the Anarchist Bookfair is that I've been involved with anarchy for a long time and with surrealism, and I'm going to be meeting up with folks, and I've already met up with folks involved in both of those worlds, which for me intersect.
Would you be able to tell us a bit about kind of your life and kind of how you started out and where you became radicalized and that kind of thing?
I guess a radicalizing influence on me was the possibility of being drafted to fight in a war, the Vietnam War, that I didn't want to kill anybody or be killed, and so it opened up a lot of questions in my mind. So that's one avenue. Another avenue for me has been through music, particularly improvisational music. And so for me, that growing up in New York, that meant a lot of the free jazz that was being made in New York in those days, people like John Coltrane and so on, made me realize you could break things down into its component pieces and reimagine them and put them in a whole new context and continue to do that in a way that is continuing the creativity that improvisation is all about. I used to teach in it was an experimental university when it first began. It was all student-centered, and there were no grades and written evaluations instead, and students were involved in all the decision-making processes. It started in 1970. That's what drew me to Illinois. Over time, it changed and became, pretty much like any university. But there was a moment, and I was there for a lot of that moment and enjoyed, my time there. It was a result of the student movement that happened in the 60s and demanding relevant forms of education and breaking out of the old academic molds. But what was strange about it was that even though it was autonomous from the state university system, it was officially a state university. So there I was, an anarchist, working for the state, teaching courses in anarchy. Lots of contradictions there. And I taught a course called Demystifying Professionalism. Yeah, so I basically would say, no, actually I'm not unprofessional, that's what you're saying. I'm anti-professional. To me, that's an important distinction. Now, when I was at that university that I described, which was called Sangamon State University, Sangamon was an indigenous name for a place of affluence. It was right at the mouth of the Sangamon River. And when I was at that university, it was a pretty exciting place. I mean, Ward Churchill was one of the students. And, there were a lot of Marxists and anarchists and radicals and people challenging different assumptions that were there. And so it was an interesting mix of people.
Some of your writing has sort of addressed the question of academia and a critique of academia. We have seen somewhat of anarchist tradition within the academy sort of growing in the last few years. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I don't think any one thing about it. I think a lot of the anarchist academics are falling into the same trap that the Marxist academics fell into when they came into positions at universities, and they got caught up in the professionalism and in the careerist kinds of concerns. However, there are other anarchists at the university, anarchist academics, if you want to call them that, who are, wary of those things and trying to their best to avoid them. After all, I was, as I say, at a state university. So, my situation was full of contradictions, and I had to kind of navigate that. I got in trouble many times for that. And I was always told that, if I didn't play by the established rules, that I would eventually lose this precious position that was so sought after. I never did. We unseated the president the year that I came up for tenure, so I actually even got tenure. He would have never given me tenure. But my faculty crew did think I deserved it, and so I got it. So once I realized that I had tenure and I could pretty much do whatever the fuck I wanted, and not have to deal with, people trying to fire me, then that gave me even more, freedom to do what I wanted, because the only thing they could hold over me was to grant me promotions. And I didn't need the promotions. I'd much rather have the freedom, so I was free to do whatever I wanted as far as I was concerned. And that was great. That gave me a lot of autonomy. Taking the heresy that you teach in the classroom into the streets is always the way that happens. And so getting busted, by the cops and stuff like that in this city of Springfield, where the university was located, that's one. But also at the university itself, challenging the structure of the university and who controls the university. And not just from a narrow union point of view of how the money is going to get divided up between the faculty and the administration, but the whole basis on which universities are run. And I would do that all the time, and that made me, very unpopular with the administrators at the university. And so one possible example is of that is when computers were first being introduced into the university, and so every faculty member was given a computer, and we began to get these messages from the president, sort of telling you what the university policy was and what you should do and all these things, and sort of pep talks and all kinds of extraneous bullshit. One of the things I realized is that I could hit reply all and respond to the president. And that was possible in those days. And I did. I responded every time the president would give a message, and she hated that. And eventually that ability to respond was taken away from everybody. They seem like small things in a way, but they do challenge the kind of one-way flow of authority and communication.
How did you first come across surrealism?
Yeah, surrealism for me was something that I first got seriously thinking about through a magazine called Arsenal Magazine, which was put out by the Chicago Surrealist Group. Chicago Surrealist Group were probably the major surrealist group in the United States, maybe even in North America. So when I began to read what they were writing, it was resonating with me. And they weren't far away in Chicago. I was living downstate, and so I would eventually go up there and get to meet them, and they're still around. And there's these events in Chicago that I'm talking about. There's a sort of a weekend of events that they're putting on and that I'm going to be part of. So it's the kind of thing with surrealism. Some people say the same thing about anarchy. It's not like there's some rules you have to follow to become an anarchist or a surrealist. You just kind of recognize yourself in surrealism or anarchism. It speaks to you. kind of confirms your own idea of who you are and where you want to go. And that's kind of what happened to me with first Chicago Surrealism. Then I began to look into the history of Surrealism beyond just the United States. And now I'm working on a historical book on the intersection of anarchy and surrealism historically. Probably mostly in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world.
So for those who don't know, what the heck is surrealism?
Number one, talking about academic institutions, don't pay any attention to what you've ever learned in school about surrealism. It's not at all what surrealism is about. Most art departments, for example, focus on a particular kind of thing, and they dismiss surrealism as essentially a passé avant-garde movement that lasted up until André Breton died in 1966, the Paris Surrealist group, and then was succeeded by Situationism and so on, as all avant-gardes always get succeeded by the next one to come along. So that's the standard history of surrealism that most people learn. It also isn't how most people use the word in a popular kind of way. When people say that's surreal, they usually mean that's weird, or that's strange, or that's creepy, or something like that. I mean, there is an aspect to surrealism that explores the dark side, but it's really more than just that. It looks for these kinds of, it explores the irrational and the connection between dream and reality. The whole idea that reality, as we know it, as it's given to us, is very impoverished. It's a very impoverished version of reality that we're asked to subscribe to. And if you question that, if you want, let's say if you're an anarchist, that you hear the sort of overlaps and the intersections, then one of the first things people will tell you who are not anarchists themselves is that you're being unrealistic. And so that's where surrealism comes in. It goes beyond reality. It tries to imagine a world in which, the reality that we know as stone wall solid is in fact in flux and can change and can be made a kind of reality that allows people to live more poetic lives.
Is there a connection between the Situationist group in the 1960s and surrealism, and how do you see that?
There's a definite connection. And Guy Debord, for example, read everything Breton ever wrote. But the Situationists in general, Venegas as well, they basically viewed themselves as succeeding surrealism. So it was almost like an Oedipal kind of relationship. They had to kill the father or the parent, to become who they wanted to be. So Venegas wrote a book called The Cavalier History of Surrealism, which is essentially an attack on surrealism, to establish, situationism in its place. And so there's that crazy history, but if you look at Paris 68, which is what most people associate with the Situationists, a lot of the slogans that were put on the wall, imagination and power, all those kinds of slogans that we all know these days, are originally surrealist kinds of slogans. The surrealists were involved in that as well. Some situationist ideas like the drift, like detournement of things that are changed around in a collage, let's say, to reveal a new meaning. Again, another surrealist kind of thing. So in a sense, the Situationists built upon surrealism. There's a history there of that kind of attempt on the part of the Situationists to distance themselves from surrealism and to make surrealism seem outmoded and so on. There are surrealist groups all around the world today, and it hasn't ever disappeared.
We're basically right in the middle of the 50th anniversary of the May 68 revolts. Is that an important reference point for you? And
Sure.
kind of why was that so important?
Well, because people rose up, and it wasn't just a small faction of people. There were links made across the population. And to see people kind of make that move, even though it never reached its full completion and got co-opted by, electoral politics and was sabotaged by the Communist Party and other authoritarian, leftist organizations, as well as the right, as well as de Gaulle and all that. Just the idea that when that kind of thing happens, it's like, it's world shaking, in the sense that you realize that there's a sense of adventure there in everyday life. There's a sense of the world opening up and new possibilities becoming available, and everything is possible. And so that's exactly the kind of thing that I think anarchists and surrealists both like to see happening.
There's some ideas in surrealism that, like the idea of myth making and the myth, various things that focus on sort of the everyday experience of human life and how to transform that. Would you be able to kind of sort of explain the importance of myth to you and in some of the writing that you've done as well?
Yeah, I think your use of the word transformation is a good one. Transformation is what it's all about. And so the kind of myth that is one in which you're encouraged to think less is possible is very different than the kind of myth that empowers you to think beyond what is, beyond the great as is. Myth plays itself out in lots of ways. I mean, one of the myths that people know most about, which has a kind of radical side to it, is the myth of Robin Hood. But people who read Robin Hood, what they like about that, I think what appeals to people about that, is that they could leave the humdrum life they're leading, or even more than the humdrum life, the oppressive life for many people that they're leading, and venture out into the world and establish a new way of living. And to me, that's the kind of myth that I like to see. It's a subversive myth. It is a myth that's emancipatory. But the myths that we're typically given are myths that do the opposite. And they want to keep us in our place, and they want to encourage us to let other people know if they try to leave the place that they've been assigned, that they're out of line, they're unrealistic, and so on. So, I mean, I look for the myths that open things up, and it's a different idea of myth than just when people point out, there's a difference between myth and reality, and I'm going to show you the reality. Often what they're doing is sort of looking at myths that have been perpetuated from above. I mean, if they're anarchists who do it, and they want to debunk those kinds of myths and explain, no, actually, this is the state, propagandizing or whatever it might be. This is the patriarchy telling you that men are this way and women are that way, and there's no in-betweens. So those myths need to be debunked. Mm-hmm. But there's another kind of myth that's inspiring. And so when I read this piece by Seaweed many years ago in Green Anarchy magazine in 2007, he wrote a piece called the Masterless Men. And I was inspired by that and went to, years later, in 2017, went to Newfoundland, which is where they're from. And I thought, well, as long as I'm there, I didn't go there for that reason, but as long as I'm there, I'll see what else I can find about the Masterless Men. And there's a ton of stuff. There was songs, there were stories, there were poems. They had this legendary place in the history of Newfoundland because they were people who were either press-ganged into the British Navy, and most of them were from Ireland or England, mostly from Ireland. And they were brought to Newfoundland, and their lives were essentially, lives in which they were subject to all these authoritarian whims of whoever might be the captain that could, flog them for disobedience and so on. And there were also indentured servants who were brought to Newfoundland to work in the fishing industry. And there were fishing admirals, as they were called, who were in charge of these fishing plantations. And these people who were indentured servants, mostly also of Irish descent in Newfoundland, were subject to near slavery. And so when some people jumped ship, literally in the case of the impressed sailors, or figuratively when they left their indentured servitude behind and went off into the barrens to establish their own community, which was also a community of not only transformation but resistance, because they'd come back and raid the stocks of the powers that be, and they were an inspiration to people of another way of being. And the fact that that was in 1650, lasted about 50 years, but people still talk about them today, is that people are inspired by the idea that you can rebel, you can live a different life, and an exhilarating one. You can look at places that are discarded, like the barrens, the wilderness, and you can go there and learn what you can from indigenous people who you might work with in certain ways in trade and so on. And you could have a relationship with indigenous people that wasn't a colonial one in the way that people in the British Empire did, that was more equal and more based on mutual sharing and learning. So, and solidarity and all of that. So these are the myths that I think we do need to kind of get in touch with and know more about, because otherwise if we don't have that, then we're confined to what is as the only possible reality. Miserabilism is the idea that misery is the only possible reality, so, suck it up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is what it is. I mean, these are popular ways in which these myths get transferred to people. When you say it is what it is, and everyone says that, I say it too, everyone says that. What does that mean, actually? It means that accept what it is, what can you do? Shrug your shoulders, it is what it is. Let's do the best we can with what we're given. But really, I'm much more of the it is what it isn't kind of mindset. That's where I want to be.
Mm-hmm. Would you call yourself a pessimist?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a pessimist exactly. I don't think of these terms like optimism and pessimism in the same way that most people do. First of all, they're both about the future, and so they're not about the moment, the present. If you're trying to live more in the present, then it doesn't make any sense to really get stuck in either optimism or pessimism. But pessimism does offer a critique. Pessimism doesn't mean you have to accept things. If you're pessimistic about a situation, doesn't mean therefore that you go along with it. Mm-hmm. There might be glimmers of what you might call hope or possibility that have been submerged, and my idea is to kind of look for those and build upon those and expand upon those. Rather than just sort of accept things, which is what some people do who are pessimistic, who consider themselves pessimistic. They basically think, well, it's hopeless, and therefore why bother? So you could think it's hopeless and still want to make trouble. That's another possibility. You could still want to, disrupt things because things are fucked up. That's one way of being. But what I'm kind of most concerned with is the way in which people are pessimistic and therefore do nothing and encourage other people to do the same. So it's what I call mutual acquiescence, and that is a term that I did come up with. And it's the opposite of mutual aid. It's like instead of solidarity and sort of encouraging people to take the next step and move beyond what is, the kind of impoverished reality that we're given, people are encouraged to keep your head down and don't challenge authority. You'll only get in trouble. Don't even imagine another kind of possibility.
One thing I liked about your piece on mutual acquiescence is how you sort of really focused on the ways that we all reproduce the domination that we identify in the state's relationship with us as an institution. We reproduce that between ourselves. How do people go about trying to kind of break out of that?
Well, the first step is to recognize it, because a lot of anarchists think that it's all top down. It's all coming from the top down, so that the reason that we don't have the freedom we want is because we have a boot on our neck from the state, from patriarchy, from religion, and all the rest. And that's certainly true. That's there. But we also reinforce it ourselves, as you were suggesting. So we have to figure out our part in it. And once we kind of come to that realization that it isn't all coming from above, that we kind of perpetuate it by our behavior, then to examine our behavior and figure out ways of relating to each other differently. Like the state, in a sense, is based on the way we relate to each other for its power. So to be unruly, to be ungovernable, and the way that happens is, obviously, the most dramatic ways in the streets, but it could happen in a workplace where you challenge the authority of the bosses, or at the same time challenge people in the union who want to just accept a bread and butter contract, and or the way in which other people who will be at the workplace with you might say, we're lucky to get this, why don't we just be satisfied with this? So always kind of sort of raising the ante, so that when people at Lazade, for example, in France, when they were fighting the airport, they said we're opposed to the airport and its world. It's not just the airport. And so when the airport was canceled just recently, a lot of the people who were only in it to fight the airport and didn't want to see the airport get built ended up bailing out or turning against the others who had a much bigger agenda. Not everybody embraced the and its world part of things. And so at first everybody's unified because they were all against the airport. But I'm always encouraging the idea that you want to kind of just see the struggle in a larger context. And that it's not all struggle and no joy. That there's community being built, there's, especially in an occupation like that on the land, there's a new way of relating to each other happening. There's new approaches to the land.
Yeah, I was looking through the Masterless Men book a little bit that you gave me, and I noticed that you made this connection with some of the research that's been done on the maroon communities and the swamp resistance in the U.S. South during slavery, and this whole kind of idea of people withdrawing from these sort of centers of power and capital and building alternative lives or forms of life on the fringes of society. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you are doing on Denman Island, or is that kind of your hope for what that project can be?
We're doing it in a limited way on Denman Island. I mean, I wouldn't say what we're doing is exclusively that, but it has that element in it, and that's one of the attractions for me. So that the first book that I wrote, Gone to Croatan, that I edited, was about the Great Dismal Swamp as a place of refuge and resistance. And it was, this kind of wasteland that was off the map. And so places like that are sometimes places that you can find available, and there are fewer and fewer places like that. Denman is not wilderness. Denman is rural, and it has places within it that are more open to kind of experimentation. But there are still people like who write about Zambia and stateless societies and in Southeast Asia. So that there's still places that do exist that way, that are elusive and elude government. They don't confront it head on necessarily, or not all the time, but mostly they evade it. So that's another way of doing things. I mean, there's no one path, to living an autonomous and liberated life, but there are hints and there are clues and there are signs of the direction to move in. And to me, it's all about moving things more in that direction rather than necessarily getting to the destination, because really, in a way, that's all about ego, to think that you can achieve something in your lifetime, which is nice if you can. But, you can move things closer to where you think it should be, and open things up a bit. And as I get older, I think, okay, well, I'm not going to see this happen myself. But, there are people who are continuing to move it along. And that's good.
When I think of what, say we're in Montreal, what a lot of anarchists are thinking about here a lot of the time is how do we build our capacity for confrontation with the state or to sort of hold space, but very much in that kind of against the police or the state, whatever the form the state takes in that moment. And whenever I talk about projects that happen outside of the cities, outside of these sort of centers, the concern gets brought up that it's kind of like retreating from that battle, or that it's not going to have this orientation of confrontation with power, that it's more about building a life that is trying to avoid that confrontation.
I think there needs to be bridges between the two battles. I don't think they're separate in the sense that they have something in common, and building on what they have in common. And I know one of the things about Denman Island, for example, is that people come up there from, they're not just the people who live there, but people come up from Vancouver or might show up from Kingston, Ontario. And it's a place that can inspire them, and they bring that back to wherever they're from. Or need some R&R after battling the cops and the fascists in the streets, and need to come up and find a place to either learn martial arts, as it happens for some people on Denman Island, or to heal from those confrontations and those battles, and to find community and support. So I see the two things as related. I don't see one as a cop-out from the other. There are people who, in either camp, who see them as, well, one detracts from the other, but I don't see it that way. There's some balance there between fighting those battles and figuring out ways in which we can build something new.
Can you talk a bit about the stuff that you get up to on Denman?
Well, I do a lot of writing on Denman. It's a great writing perch. Since I've gotten to Denman, I've probably written about, maybe 7 or 8 books. So I've been there about 15 years. So writing is one. But also, aside from writing, we've been fighting gentrification. We were fighting a coal mine which was to be built on Vancouver Island, not too far from Denman Island. And we successfully were able to stop that mine from being built. Can't take full credit for it. The bottom fell out of the mining industry, and it wasn't as profitable. But we did have some role to play in preventing that mine from happening. That was a very popular kind of issue. Almost everybody on Denman, felt the same way. Other issues on Denman, people are more divided about. Some people say, well, gentrification isn't so bad, and because I can get this that I didn't get before and have access to that. or that a developer will offer something in return for getting more high-priced housing that will keep people off the island, who are the riffraff, essentially, our people. So, I mean, there's a constant kind of battle there. People think of gentrification as only an urban issue. Like, people don't think of rural areas as being gentrified. They think of, Hamilton or something. Rural areas are in danger of gentrification too, and a lot of the people who live in them don't like that term. So when I first moved there, I remember I would talk about gentrification to people, not necessarily the anarchist crew, but just the average person on Denman. It's, the anarchists have a presence on Denman, but we're by no means the average person on Denman. But the average person on Denman is a little more open-minded maybe than some other places, and they would all say, oh no, that's an urban thing. And over the years, that's changed. People now are realizing that it's an issue on Denman as well. I'm bringing in a speaker from Crime Think who will be, if he gets across the border, be doing a talk on repression and resistance in the Trump era. And so we have speakers come through. There are people working against the fish farms. There's occupations of the fish farms that on the coast that have had Denman people involved with those, or people who are up north fighting against the LNG industry. And so there are people who don't limit themselves to Denman either. Mm-hmm. There's more regional or more BC kind of oriented.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about the radio broadcast we did together, and how you mentioned that you like how it kind of just goes out into the airwaves and that it disappears. It's not recorded. It's not on the internet. It's just kind of this temporal thing.
Yeah. The radio that we do doesn't really go beyond the island. Mm. And so it doesn't have that kind of range. People aren't streaming it all over. One of the things I think that happens with streaming that can be, at least should be considered anyway, is that people are no longer doing radio for their local community. They're doing it for their uncle who lives, in Thunder Bay, and their their ex-girlfriend who now lives somewhere in Newfoundland. And that changes things. That means that you're no longer kind of focused on, in our case, the island. So ours is island radio. It's all about that. And it's, we come out of the static, and when our shows are over, we pull the transmitter plug and we're back into the static, and we vanish into thin air. And there's a magic to that. Mm-hmm. It's magical. And that's one of the things that, and there isn't a constant record of it. It's unlike everything else today, which has to be documented. And I'm not criticizing podcasting. The only criticism I ever have of podcasting is some podcasters like to call themselves pirates, and I don't think that's true. But, pirate, you're doing illegal radio. Podcasting is legitimate in terms of the eyes of the state. You're allowed to do it. That doesn't make it bad or worse or better, but somehow it doesn't make sense when somebody says they're doing pirate radio and they're really podcasting. Mm-hmm. We're actually doing an illegal radio station, challenging the right of the government to decide, whether what people can listen to on the airwaves. And so that's a different kind of battle, and so it establishes an autonomous zone, and it sort of opens people's minds to the fact that if we can take the government out of that aspect of our lives, what other aspects of our life can we take the government out of? It becomes a way of offering people a way in to going beyond the reality that's a governed reality, and seeing what other possible autonomous zones can be built, and then seeing how those can come together. Mm-hmm. Was there a campfire too when you went on there? Yeah, stuff like that happens. So that all of a sudden, it isn't just about what's going on in the studio, but there's a campfire, people are hanging out. So, I mean, it offers, to me, it's a subtle thing that you have to experience almost, that you're in this little trailer and you're kind of, a lot of the pretension of radio is gone, and it's just a way of communicating with your community, and I like that about it. Probably the one we had the most dramatic one was we forgot the microphone was on once, and it was fall, and it was harvest season, and we were talking about all the different people whose harvests were coming in around then. And then all of a sudden we realized that the microphone was on.
I noticed that, at least when I was in Denman, it seemed like there was a real, the community there seemed genuinely intergenerational.
Yes.
And you're one of the older people around.
Yeah.
Do you find like that you have a place in that community and that you haven't been sort of like put in the old person box or anything like that? Like
Usually.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually I think it's very successful, the intergenerational kind of experimentation that goes on there. And I like that about it. I don't like to be put in that box. There'll be times when it happens, but it's never malicious when it happens. Or it's never consciously exclusive. It's usually unconsciously exclusive. And it works the other way around too. I mean, but you know, there are a number of people on the island who they do tend to stay within their age group, and it's partly because they have like people like themselves who are a certain age that either grew up in the same time period and they're now nostalgic about it, or else are contemporary people of their own age and they want to hang out with their contemporaries exclusively. But for the most part, that doesn't really operate. I mean, there's much more openness to the fact that here we are, we're all on this island together, and we have to figure out some way of dancing with each other. Otherwise, it's going to be like hell. So we're open to kind of who's this, who's that, and they're interesting people, and age really is one minor thing, really, in terms of who might be interesting. So most of my friends are actually a lot younger than me on Denman, but I have friends my own age too, and I'm looking for certain kinds of people that, kindred spirits that I share things with, and age doesn't really enter into it so much for me. It's more, who is this person?
I guess just if people want to find your writing or interact with some of the stuff that you've written or said over the years, where's the best place for them to do that?
Well, I've done my writing for a number of different publishers. So my initial things that I wrote were for a ton of media in New York City. I've done a few things for Eberhardt Press in Portland, Oregon, and some things for LBC just recently. This Masterless Men thing is for LBC, Little Black Heart. So, I mean, you can contact those publishers or come to an anarchist book fair and you'll find them. Or, I mean, they are a lot of those things are carried at, some AK Press Distro or something like that. But they're hard to find at the checkout counter of your local supermarket.
Is there a particular idea or project that you're paying particular attention to right now, or like a specific direction that you're excited about?
Yeah, I've been working for the last 5 years on this history of anarchy and surrealism, and all the intersections that have gone on. And partly in response to that thing we talked about earlier, where the situationists will have dissed the surrealists, and people think the surrealists have nothing to offer in terms of anarchy. So I wanted to unearth all this anarchist history that is really very rich, and so it's one of these books that's historical with chapters, and it's I've been spending a lot of time with it because you don't want to get anything wrong. You don't want to attribute something to someone that they didn't really think or believe, or say that they were in league with a group that they really hated.
Yeah.
So you want to get it right, and so I've been spending a lot of time with that and hearing different people's opinions of the same situation from a surrealist and an anarchist point of view. So there have been lots of histories of surrealism, but there have been none from an anarchist point of view. And that's what this book will be about. I hope to finish it by the end of next year at the latest.
And did you still want to share some poetry?
But there was a surrealist poet named Ted Jones, African-American poet. He's now dead, but he lived for a time in Canada. He lived all over the world, really. He lived in Timbuktu, but he also comes from a place in Illinois called Cairo, Illinois, which is Illinois Creole for a place that would be spelled like it was Cairo, but in southern Illinois it's called Cairo. And so Ted had this poem that he usually opens his readings with that we can close this show with, I guess. If you see a person walking down the street talking out loud to himself or herself, don't run away from that person. They are a poet. You have nothing to fear from a poet but the truth.